Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder. I'm your host, Tyler. Now, it may sound a little bit different this week. I'm using a new setup and a different microphone, and I'm going to test it out, see how I like it, see how it sounds, once I'm done recording. And if I like it, I'm going to keep it. So give me feedback if you like the new sound. Let me know if you don't like it. Let me know so I can go back to my old setup if absolutely necessary. I want to jump right into this week's case. This is the most recent case we've ever done, and it may also be the most controversial. It involves an officer-related shooting of a black man. So it could push some buttons in the audience. However, you won't find me opining about qualified immunity or police funding in this episode. This is not a Fox News or NBC segment. The issue here is a case that I think is important because it's gaining national attention. Part of my reasoning for starting the show is to learn about and convey the history of Nashville as well as discuss its most infamous cases. This gives me the opportunity to do that, and I won't shy away from tackling tough issues in a thoughtful way. But just be aware, I'm going to stick to the facts and the facts only in this episode. There won't be much commentary to go along with it. And I use official documents, so I hope that will do some speaking for me. And that said, let's get right into it. I use several articles for this episode, so be aware that some of them are local, some of them are national, ABC News, NBC News, New York Times, and just be aware that there may be a follow-up to this. It's a fairly prominent story in national news, and I want to make sure that I get as much of it right as possible. But I felt like I couldn't not do this case. It's about the shooting of Daniel Hambrick, and it's right in the midst of a huge movement in this country to change the way we think about police and shootings and, deadly force. So, like I said before, it may trigger some people, but that's not the intention at all. I hope that this case will bring you some clarity on the issue and at least let you know what's going on and what happened in this city. This one has very little history involved in it. It's more just a recent case that I just go into depth on. So hope you enjoy it, and I'll be sure to include the links in the posting itself so you can do some independent research. Let's move on. I'm going to start, the bulk of the episode will come from the warrant and the arrest of the officer involved in the shooting. So it's as close to factual from a third-person point of view as possible. On the night of July 26th, 2018, Officer Andrew Delkey was working with the Juvenile Crimes Task Force. They had been charged with looking for stolen vehicles and certain known juvenile offenders. While patrolling around the 37208 zip code in North Nashville, Officer Delkey stopped at a stop sign at 10th Avenue North and Ponder Place. Shortly thereafter, a white four-door Chevrolet Impala stopped at the stop sign at 10th and Kello. Officer Delkey became suspicious when the Impala stopped at the stop sign and conceded the right-of-way by not pulling out in front of him. When the vehicle finally did pull into the 10th Avenue North direction, Officer Delkey followed behind it. He then ran the license plate and learned that the Impala was not a stolen vehicle. Nevertheless, because Officer Delkey understood that part of the task force directive was to make traffic stops, he continued to follow to see if he could develop a reason to stop the Impala. After some time, Officer Delkey turned on his blue lights as the Impala pulled onto I-65 South at Rosa Parks Boulevard. The Impala didn't pull over. Officer Delkey, following policy, turned off his emergency equipment and did not engage in vehicle pursuit. He continued to follow the Impala from a distance. He observed I-65 South and the Impala turned right onto Charlotte Avenue. He lost track of the Impala shortly thereafter. Officer Delkey was never able to see the driver of the Impala or determine how many people were in the vehicle. Officer Delkey then drove through nearby neighborhoods looking for the Impala. He pulled into an apartment parking lot and mistook a different white four-door sedan for his target vehicle. Officer Delkey pulled into the lot quickly and stopped near this other car. Several individuals were in the area. As Officer Delkey pulled up, one man, later determined to be Daniel Hambrick, began to run. Officer Delkey immediately began a foot pursuit, yelling commands for the man to stop. Officer Delkey did not know the identity of the man he was chasing. He believed the man who was running may have been connected to the white vehicle he had misidentified as the target vehicle. He did not know with certainty if the man was connected in the misidentified white sedan, if he was connected to the Impala, or if he was connected to either vehicle. Officer Delkey chased Mr. Hambrick through the parking lot towards Joe Johnston. As Mr. Hambrick neared Joe Johnston, Officer Delkey saw a gun in Mr. Hambrick's hand, a 9mm. The two continued to run west, parallel to Joe Johnston. Officer Delkey gave several commands, including stop, drop the gun, and drop the gun, or I'll shoot. When Mr. Hambrick continued to run away and did not drop the gun, Officer Delkey decided to use deadly force. He stopped, assumed a firing position, and aimed his service weapon. He then fired 4 shots at Daniel Hambrick. One shot struck Mr. Hambrick in the center of his back and lodged in his spine. Another passed through Mr. Hambrick's left torso from back to front. A third bullet entered the back of Mr. Hambrick's head, traveled through his brain, and lodged in the front of his skull. The other shot missed Mr. Hambrick and struck a nearby building. The medical examiner determined Mr. Hambrick's cause of death to be multiple gunshot wounds. Now, with cases on this podcast, I normally talk about both the victim and the killer. I try to give as much historical perspective as possible, as much knowledge about either person as I can. But I'm choosing not to do that in this case. In part because there isn't much to know about Officer Delkey. He's a pretty young cop. I think he was 25 at the time of the shooting. Early on in his career. And this isn't a salacious serial killer of crime or bludgeoning death. This is a kind of a third rail case, and my wife even questioned whether or not I should do this one. Understandably, because it is kind of politically toxic to talk about. Because you can get details wrong, and your intent can be misunderstood, and you don't want to come off as someone who's insensitive to either forgive that. You don't want to be insensitive to either the black community in these cases, and you also don't want to misrepresent what's happening with police. And I'm sensitive to that. And the fact that Daniel Hambrick has had a prior record to this case, I think is irrelevant. Because it has nothing to do with what happened on this night. So I'm choosing not to delve into all of those details because just to put everything out on Front Street, if I talk about Daniel Hambrick's previous offenses, then it gives credence to the idea that somehow he deserved what happened in 2018. Or it could be construed that way. And I certainly don't want that. So I'm just kind of choosing to tiptoe around this because I think that it still serves the purpose of this show to provide you with this case, which is really important and indicative of something that's going on in America that a lot of people are really passionate about. So, just to give you some background, I'm going to move into the investigation, which is fairly short. Now, pretty quickly, a surveillance video from across the street was released in August of 2018. So a month later. And shortly thereafter, Delkey was charged with criminal homicide for shooting and killing Daniel Hambrick. In a statement released in the wake of the shooting, then Mayor David Briley said, quote, "The decision to file charges was a necessary step," adding, quote, "Put simply, we must have laws that are fairly, equally, and transparently applied," end quote. In 2019, Daniel Hambrick's family sued Officer Delkey and the city, contending that the shooting was motivated in part by a culture of fear, violence, racism, and impunity in the police department. The lawsuit sought $30 million in punitive damages. In March, Nashville officials agreed to settle the lawsuit for $2.25 million. And then things kind of remain in stasis for a couple of years. Delkey is serving time as he awaits trial. And COVID happens, pandemic, then we have the year of George Floyd and the protests last summer, among other things. And the case gets taken back up a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, really. So I'm going to read an excerpt from an NBC News article. And the article's title is "Tennessee Courtroom Erupts in Chaos When Former Police Officer Pleads Guilty to Manslaughter." I'm going to read basically verbatim from the article. The grieving mother of a black man killed by a white police officer during a 2018 shooting that was captured on video told him Friday that he better watch his back in jail, prompting chaos in a Tennessee courtroom where the ex-officer pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. This is a direct quote. "I hate you. I hate you. I don't accept no apology," Vicky Hambrick screamed at Andrew Delkey, a former officer with the Metropolitan Nashville Police. "You better watch your back in jail, mother effer." I'll say it that way. The scene continued to spiral when the other Hambrick family supporters also began shouting. The hearing was temporarily stopped and the courtroom was cleared. Vicki Hambrick was vehemently opposed to the manslaughter plea deal her lawyer, Joy Kimbrough, described in court before the explosion of emotions. Hambrick was not told about Delkey's pact with prosecutors to plead guilty in exchange for a 3-year sentence, Kimbrough said. Delkey was expected to begin trial this month on a charge of first-degree murder. Before the pandemonium, Delkey, 27, taking long pauses with his voice sometimes quavering, apologized for killing 25-year-old Daniel Hambrick. Quote, "I am pleading guilty today because I recognize that my use of deadly force was not reasonably necessary under all the circumstances," he read from his statement. "I recognize that what happened on July 26, 2018 was tragic. Mrs. Hambrick lost her son that day, and I'm responsible for her loss. I'm deeply sorry for the harm my actions caused, and I hope that Mr. Hambrick's family will obtain some comfort for my acceptance of responsibility and my guilty plea today." End quote. The lawyer, Kimbrough, read a statement from Vicki Hambrick, who is legally blind, about what her deceased son meant to her and how she viewed a plea as an injustice. Quote, "He was my only child and the love of my life. Daniel recognized at an early age that I had a disability, but he was never ashamed of me or embarrassed by me. He loved me unconditionally and constantly said he would always take care of me," the statement said. This is the end of the quote. Kimbrough continued reading it. Here's some more. "I am angry, mad, and disgusted. I am against the way the state and the defense joined hands to protect this racist, biased, anti-black criminal system. My son was murdered on video by Nashville police. My son has a right, he has a right to a public jury trial." End quote. Regarding the decision not to go to trial, here's a quote from a recent New York Times article on the subject. Glenn R. Funk, the Nashville district attorney, defended the deal after the hearing, saying he was concerned that a jury might not have convicted Mr. Delkey had the case gone to trial. He noted that Mr. Hambrick was holding a gun when he was shot. Quote, "Members of my office on the trial team acknowledged that there was well over 50% chance that this jury would hang," which I think is an unfortunate use of phrase. That's me. Mr. Funk said after the hearing, adding that he had been warned that a jury could have split along racial lines. And no verdict, no judgment, no accountability. The emotion that we saw in this courtroom today would have been played out 100-fold if there had been no accountability in this case. End quote. Before Mr. Delkey's guilty plea, a Nashville police officer had never been convicted in the on-duty shooting of a black man, Mr. Funk said. Well, now there has been, Mr. Funk said. He's been convicted. He's a convicted felon for the rest of his life. End quote. It's expected that Andrew Delkey will serve about another 1.5 years, given time served. He was given 3 years total, and I don't think he'll be able to apply for any sort of commutation or shortened sentence, so he'll have to serve the full 3 years. And I'm going to withhold my own personal opinions on this one. I usually give my own 2 cents, but I hope you'll forgive me for not doing that in this case, since it goes at the very heart of, one of our country's most politically charged subjects. If you're interested in learning more, I'm going to include plenty of articles and citations in the post itself. So go to the podcast. There will be links for everything. And if there are any updates in the case, then I will certainly be obliged to update the podcast. But just know that this one is a tough one, but an important one. And I felt like I'd be doing a disservice to the podcast, to the audience, and really to the city and everyone else if I didn't cover it. So I wanted to make sure that I did, and it's a difficult topic, and it's hyper partisan, but the story needs to be told, and I'm glad that I did that. So with that, I'm going to end this episode, a fairly short episode of Music City Murder, and I hope you'll join us next time as we dive into the history and the crime that makes Music City tick. Thank you. I'm Tyler. See you next time.